Hello and welcome to the Good Society Forum. My name is Emma Skye and I'm Director of Yale World Fellows and co-host of the Good Society Forum, which is a community of change makers around the world with a common quest to build the good society. My co-host is Nizam Uddin, a 2019 Yale World Fellow and a dedicated advocate for social mobility and community integration across the globe. Niz.
Thank you, Emma, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our April Good Society Forum webinar, and for joining us and for being part of our community that is very much dedicated to building the good society. If you haven't already, please do follow us on our usual social media channels, on Twitter at Good Soc Forum, on LinkedIn, Good Society Forum page, also on Facebook, where we have a page at Good Society Forum. And as ever, if you have any ideas for sessions about how we can together build a good society, or you wish to be a panelist, please email us info@goodsocietyforum.com. Our plan today is our usual format for those of you who've been following us for a year. It's a year pretty much to the week. So, happy anniversary to our community for being with us and for engaging with us during so many amazing conversations over the course of that period. So the plan will be to hear from our three speakers and then we will take your questions. But as ever, if you have any questions, thoughts, musings, feel free to put them into the chat function. We are really keen for you to participate. As ever, I have a quick question for those of you who have joined us. We'd love to know where you are tuning in from today. Where in the world are you? What city are you currently in, or where do you consider home? I would love for you to share that on the chat function. You should have a chat button at the bottom of your screen. Please do let us know. We'd love to know where you are from today. I certainly am here from London. Emma's in New Haven. Livia from Bogota in Colombia. Hi. Monte from Toronto, Peter from Cornwall on Hudson, Inara from Long Island, New York, Abdi from Aden in Yemen. Thank you so much for joining us. Sonali from New Delhi, and we'll hear from our guests in a second in terms of where they are all situated. We're so lucky to have such an incredible global community. Dereje from Ethiopia, thank you so much for joining us. It's incredible to have such an incredible global community. So Emma, what's our topic today?
So today we will be discussing human rights protection in Africa. The new normal way of living as a result of COVID-19 has had huge repercussions on the human rights of most vulnerable groups. This includes economic, social, and cultural rights. During the COVID-19 pandemic, a number of human rights issues have emerged regarding the ways in which different countries implement emergency measures to control the spread of the virus around the world. Today, we'll be examining human rights protection in an African context, discussing some of these fundamental human rights that have been violated during the emergency period some countries declared as a result of the pandemic. While it's true that the virus is a major threat to life, it is crucial to take a closer look at the human rights violations accompanying pandemic response that may have far-reaching and long-lasting consequences on vulnerable groups. In this panel, we hope to address the problem, the human rights that are not adequately integrated into emergency response policy management in African countries. And we hope to hear proposed solutions, making recommendations on how we can align human rights concerns with crisis management and ensure the rights of vulnerable people are protected. Our first speaker today is Edouane Ngumta, an attorney and civil litigation expert working in Cameroon. She is the founder and CEO of Haven of Rebirth Cameroon, a one-stop center that helps victims of sexual and gender-based violence. She's also a 2020 Yale World Fellow. She has worked as the executive director of the Center for Public Interest Law, Cameroon, and has partnered with the Center for Democracy and Development, West Africa, to document cases of human rights violations by state and non-state actors in the fight against terrorism in the Lake Chad Basin. Throughout her career, Edouane has fought for the rights of marginalized communities and juveniles, conceiving the Juvenile Detention Project, which aims to secure the release of many young people awaiting trial in prisons and police cells. She also offers legal services on a pro bono basis to victims of sexual and gender-based violence, and is part of a team of legal experts working on a draft law on child marriage in Cameroon. Edouane, welcome.
Thank you very much, Emma and Zem. Thank you, Dr. Juga, and thank you, Tutu, for agreeing to work with me on this discussion. I think Africa has gone a long way to fight human rights violations, but in threatening situations like during the COVID pandemic, we realized that a lot of human rights violations as a result of the laws or the measures that were taken by most African states to try to mitigate the spread of the virus. We're just going to discuss the laws. I'm going to look at Cameroon particularly as a case study, the laws that were put in place and how these laws actually affected the human rights of the citizens and the way forward. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. I hope I'm able to. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, Edouane.
Okay. What's going on here? Oops, I have the screen in front of me, but what's happening?
Edouane, can you do it without your presentation?
Oh, okay, all right. I'll just go ahead. Okay, we are looking at human rights protection in Africa, and we are looking at emergency response policy management. Now, in March 2020, the COVID-19 was declared as a pandemic by the World Health Organization, and they called for nations to take urgent actions to prevent the spread of the virus. Unfortunately, African countries imposed measures that threatened the very existence of citizens by violating basic human rights, and policymakers did not take into consideration the impact of such violations on the citizens. Therefore, some of these rights were not adequately integrated in their emergency response, basic fundamental human rights that are guaranteed in international instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And these rights are protected so much so that any violation of these rights becomes a major concern and can attract international attention. Now we are looking at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as the guarantor of the protection of human rights during emergency situations. Now in this instrument, Article 4 states that in the time of public emergency, which threatens the life of the nation and the existence of which is officially proclaimed, the state parties to the present covenant may take measures derogating from their obligations under the present covenant to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation, provided that such measures are not inconsistent with their other obligations under international law and do not involve discrimination solely on the ground of race, color, sex, language, religion, or social origin. Now, the state, of course, the state the obligation of most states under this present covenant is to promote universal respect for the observance of human rights and freedoms. And so if any state has to derogate from such obligations because of an emergency situation, then it must not be inconsistent with their other obligations under international law. Therefore, they have to work in concurrence with their national constitutions and other regional instruments so as to guarantee the legality of any laws or policies put in place to prevent the said emergency situation. Now, let us look at the case of Cameroon. When the coronavirus broke out in Cameroon, it was expected that a state of emergency be declared, just like in other African states, given the threatening nature of the virus on the lives of the citizens, as well as the economic repercussions that it was going to have on the economy. But we should also take note that in Cameroon, emergency law is solely the prerogative of the President of the Republic. He alone, the Constitution states that he alone can declare a state of emergency when circumstances so warrant in the event of a serious threat to the nation's territorial integrity or to its existence, its independence, or its institutions. That is Article 9 of the Cameroon's Constitution. But so far, Cameroon's government has not declared a state of emergency as per the law. Instead, they have had a show or a display of so many measures which restrict freedoms that have been put in place, and this has once more brought up the issue of the protection of human rights and public liberties when emergency situations do arise. The measures used by the state of Cameroon to fight COVID-19 is evidence that the country does not have any emergency legal framework applicable in the event of a health emergency. However, there's a law, that is law number 86/06 of 16th December 1986 on the general reorganization of civil protection. And this law can govern urgent health situations since it applies to disasters and calamities as well as the consequences of these health situations. But be it as it may be, this gap would have been filled if the state had adopted a legal framework to cater for the present as other similar, just like in other countries. And if this was done, they would have taken into consideration the rights that have actually been violated. Let us go ahead to look at the measures that the country has adopted to fight the coronavirus. We have two measures, the legally binding measures and the measures that are not legally binding. Under legally binding measures, these are those measures that are contained in legal instruments such as administrative decisions by administrative heads, local authorities, or a decree or an order, whether they are taken by central or local authorities. All of them become binding. Now, the non-binding, legally binding measures include those that are contained in documents such as the measure instructed by the President of the Republic and made public by the Prime Minister in Cameroon for the government response strategy to the coronavirus pandemic. Now, this was an instruction that was given by the President, and it was made public by the Prime Minister. And under this response strategy, they came out with a number of measures that were to be put in place to be able to restrict the spread of the virus. We have closure of borders, closure of schools, the ban of gathering of more than 50 people, the closure of drinking spots, restaurants, and other places of leisure as from 6 p.m., the restriction of urban and interurban movement, and the systematic wearing of face masks in all public places. these are the measures that were put in place by the government in a bid to fight the spread of the virus. But because this measure is not legally binding, they did not follow the rules of the Constitution. They had to infringe into the human rights of the citizens. Now we are going to look at the effects of the measures that have been put in place. Most of these policy measures led to the violation of human rights, such as the right of education. Schools were closed down for about close to about 8 months. Students were unable to go to school. Pupils were at home, and they instituted what was known as online education, which was not very, very practical in Cameroon because they didn't take into consideration the children that are in the rural areas without access to television or network or telephones that they could get their lessons from it. It also led to infringe the right of the freedom of religion. Churches were also asked to be closed down, and so many people were unable to go to the church, to the mosque, and other places of worship. Freedom of association was also was banned during that period. Many people were not able to attend meetings, social gatherings, to meet friends and stuff like that. Movements were also limited. People could not travel, and if you had to travel, you were obliged to put on a face mask, without which you are going to be harassed by the police. They're not even asking you to wear your face mask, but it was kind of another means of encouraging corruption, because the police officers, most of them were there to collect money from those who did not have their mask on. We also witnessed a rise in the violation of some other rights, such as gender-based violence. Since that is my area, I also want to say that I witnessed an increase in reports that I got from especially victims of domestic violence, because partners were forced to be together in the same house, living together under the same roof, and issues came up that led to tensions. A lot of tensions were built in homes, and one thing led to the other. So these are the rights that were infringed as a result of the measures that were put in place by the government of Cameroon. And we are saying that Cameroon does not have any emergency legal framework applicable in the event of health emergencies, but they have legal frameworks in other issues like political uprisings and all of that. They have legal frameworks that have been put in place in the constitution of the country. And this one means that other laws, or the state depended on existing laws that were there to fight COVID-19. And these laws infringed into the human rights of its citizens. They didn't take those rights into considerations. Now, these restrictions affected the freedom of trade, movement, and all of that. And these very rights are protected by our own constitution. And so it was in a gross violation of the constitution of the nation. So what we are saying, therefore, is that the state, not only Cameroon or other African states, when they want to respond to any emergency situation, especially when it comes to health issues, because they also neglect frontline workers who are mostly women. Frontline workers and caregivers, caretakers, they are mostly women, and their own rights were not also put into consideration. So we are saying that the states.
Edwin, thank you. Can I stop you there to bring in our second speaker, and we can continue with this when we get to the Q&A?
Okay, I was almost done. I was concluding though.
I'm sorry, we'll have a chance for you to add more, because I'd like to introduce our second speaker, who is Ernest Tatanji, a founding member and senior partner of Ogre & Co law firm, and president of the Cameroon Bar Association Human Rights Commission and Training Commission. He also serves as a senior lecturer in law at the University of Yaoundé and consults for the World Bank. and he was a 2007 Yale World Fellow. As chairman of the National Human Rights Observatory, Ogre works fearlessly to remedy human rights abuses in Cameroon. He is particularly focused on cases of child abuse and violation of the rights of girls, and has defended men charged with homosexual acts. His law firm is the first in Cameroon to launch a pro bono practice for those unable to foot legal bills, with services provided for criminal and human rights cases. Ogre, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Emma. And thank you, Nizam, for putting together this great webinar, which is organized by the Good Society Forum and I would say the Yale Well Fellows program. It is a pleasure to work with Edwin on this, and with Tutu, whom I'm meeting for the very first time. It's also a shared pleasure to have the other panelists on board. The topic which has been communicated to me is human rights protection in Africa, and I would say especially human rights protection in the context of the prevailing COVID-19 situation. Human rights protection in Africa, for one who is a practitioner and one who's been involved in cases relating to human rights for the past over 21 years, I would say is already sufficiently precarious. And it has all the more been exacerbated by the present sanitary situation with the COVID-19 measures that have been introduced. And I would say most of the measures introduced following European and US models without taking into consideration the specificities of the African continent. In Europe and in the US, that are far advanced than Africa in matters of the protection of human rights, have also been hardly hit by COVID-19, and some of the measures that have been put into place to protect the right to life, to protect human rights, human life, one can easily say are measures that do not respect rights as provided in the instruments in the first place, because we watched instances where persons actually went out on the streets claiming certain rights, stating that those rights have been violated. The continent of Africa is still in most cases struggling with the first generation rights. As Edwin mentioned, those rights that are contained in the first universal instruments, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So it's even more challenging to talk about the second generation rights, which are those rights that are more economic, social, and cultural in nature. And was still, and I would exclude the third generation rights completely from my discussion, because those rights in Africa are rights that are not very much in contemplation at the moment. The issues relating to the right to health, which is a second generation right, touch again particularly on one of the main first generation rights, which is the mother of all human rights, and that is the right to life. If you don't have life, you cannot enjoy good health. And in order for you to enjoy good health, you must have life. And it's the role of the state to protect the right to health. But the situation, the present situation is such that the state itself is caught in between questions of rights and questions of survival. How do you protect human rights? How do you guarantee the right to health while protecting the other rights? I think that is where the dilemma is, and that is where the issue comes in. Now, COVID-related violations justiciable? Can one really complain? If, as Edwin mentioned, I listened to her presentation, but the question I want to ask is, if the state decides that everyone should be locked up for 14 days, for example, and to put an end to a pandemic, or to help put into place measures that may help curb a pandemic, can we subsequently say the rights of persons were violated? Now, individuals have the right to work, that is an economic, social, and cultural right. Individuals equally have the right to education, which is an economic, social, and cultural right. But if under specific circumstances, the state decides that they would put aside those rights, can you turn around and attack the state for violation of your right? Now, if the state does not put into place the necessary measures, can you attack the state for not putting into place the necessary measures, which would amount to a violation of certain rights or the right to health? That is the big question which we would have to answer in our discussion. Now, there are rights that are derogable and there are rights that are non-derogable. You would expect that the state should have taken the step to go through the international process of derogating from certain rights. But even if they did that, would that have been a sufficient defense for the violation of certain rights? Now, how do you manage rights such as the right to education, the right to work, the right to health in a situation where the state has to protect life? That is the life of everybody without exception. And what about the situation, and that is particular in Africa, where persons deliberately choose to go against the government guidelines because of traditional beliefs? Now, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, that is in 2020, the guidelines were strictly adhered to. Then it turned out that there were current discussions about the virus not being an African virus because so many people were not killed in Africa as they were in Europe and the United States of America. And that put so many persons off guard. Now there's been a resurgence and a more lethal variant of the virus is in Africa. Now, who will bear the blame for this change? Is it the people who went back to their traditional practices and thought that there are certain leaves or certain things that you can take and they will protect you from the virus, or the state would have continued in a more ruthless approach to protect the persons? And who will be responsible for any fatalities or calamities that may occur as a result of those traditional practices? What of a situation where you have hundreds of people who decide to come together to take particular treatment, which is not medically recommended? And if such treatment actually turns against them, who will be responsible for that? Is it the state or the individuals themselves? So my worry is more of questioning the situation today rather than accusing the state for violation of rights. As I started off, I said the problem of human rights in Africa is precarious enough. African countries are still struggling with those elementary rights, which are the first generation rights, on how to protect them. Now you bring in a more sophisticated issue. How do we handle those? are those violations really justiciable? Can you take the state to any of the courts or any of the instances where rights are protected for violation of human rights because the state put into place certain measures that were for general interest as opposed to some measures that would have been for private interest? I would like to stop here, and during the question and answer session, I may have the opportunity to develop a little further. But my presentation was just to raise the issues which I'm struggling with, and I'm sure several other persons are struggling with also, so that we can discuss them in this webinar. Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you so much, Nizam, for the opportunity.
No, thank you. Incredible intervention there. And I think a really good elaboration of what Edwan had already mentioned. So our third speaker that I'm delighted to invite to speak is Tutu Alicante, the founder and executive director of EG Justice in Equatorial Guinea. Previously, Tutu served as a consultant for many international NGOs promoting transparency and accountability in the extractive industry. As an Equal Justice Works Fellow, Tutu has worked as an employment attorney with the Southern Migrant Legal Services, where he represented migrant farm workers from across the Americas. A native of Equatorial Guinea, Tutu frequently guest lectures on socio-political affairs in his native country and across Africa, on human rights law, on the rule of law, transparency, and strategic litigation against kleptocracy. Tutu has written for the Washington Post, The Guardian, The Economist, amongst many others, and has been a long-standing activist advocating for human rights in his native Equatorial Guinea and across the continent of Africa. Tutu, we're delighted to have you with us. Thank you for joining us, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Nizam. It's such a, I'm so delighted to be here. You know, in fact, I don't know if Muriel told you I was 2 hours early. I tried to join the call at 12. That's how excited I was to have this conversation. So thank you very much. You know, this is an honor for me to be here. So I work on Equatorial Guinea, right? And this is a Central African nation that made news last month following a deadly series of explosions that were caused by the negligent storage of dynamite and explosives at a military camp in a very, very densely populated area in the largest city in Equatorial Guinea. This is Bata, right? Now, I start by telling you this story, very tragic event that took the lives of hundreds of people and left thousands homeless and injured, just to underscore the point that tragedies rarely happen in a vacuum or by chance. Right? So the use of storage explosives in civilian areas poses a well-known risk of death, severe injuries, and destruction of property. Most governments are aware of this, right? And they can take, or they can choose to take appropriate measures to avoid recklessly endangering civilians. Now, I'm a human being, so I know negligence is a human factor. And adverse events will happen. Unforeseen pandemics will happen. When those things happen, however, governments have to own their mistake. They have to recognize the situation. They have to engage in full and transparent investigations. They have to release information, and they have to compensate family members. They have to ensure that people affected by pandemics have a way to continue living, right? So going to COVID specifically, the broad police powers which Edwan and Dr. Duga spoke about, which were granted by governments in Equatorial Guinea and many other places in Africa, the sweeping lockdown measures, the curfews introduced, retracted, and reinstituted in many cases, blindly copying the West, right? The censorship and misinformation campaigns often championed by our own governments. None of this happens in a vacuum, right? None of the drastic adverse measures and the resulting negative effects and consequences that takes the lives of millions of people are happenstance, right? To give you a sense of where I come from, Transparency International ranks my country, Equatorial Guinea, among the most corrupt in the world, along with Libya and Sudan. Freedom House considers Equatorial Guinea worst of the worst as not free, with a score of 5 out of 100. In Africa, that's surpassed only by Eritrea and South Sudan. President Obiang, who rules Equatorial Guinea, is the longest ruling head of state in the world. He is an authoritarian despot who took power in 1979 after killing his uncle. He is the chief of the army. He is the nation's first magistrate. As the president of the only ruling governing party, or the governing party, he also controls the legislative system, right? Because all the MPs, all the senators belong to that one single party, right? The president's eldest son, Theodorin, is the vice president, and he's in charge of the highly repressive security forces that even during COVID was in charge of arresting people and torturing people, right? Gabriel, the other son, one of the wealthiest people in my country, is the Minister of Mines and Industry, and so on. All the children of the president, and their more than dozen, occupy high-ranking positions in the government. So in short, I'm talking about a country, Equatorial Guinea, the Kuwait of Africa, the country with the highest per capita GDP, but also the country with the widest gap between income per capita and Human Development Index. I'm talking about a country that is a textbook case for complete state capture, and a textbook case for the interplay between kleptocracy and human rights violations. This is a country where not a single human right is respected, right? So, and this is the context that myself and colleagues of mine must contend with when thinking about protecting and advancing human rights in the time of COVID. This is the situation we must grapple with as we endeavor to articulate a way forward, a way that avoids exacerbation of inequalities, a way that creates a good society. So, my friends, the stake could not be higher. COVID-19 and the government of Equatorial Guinea's abysmal response to the pandemic killed my neighbor, my friend, Eugenio. This is the kid that grew up climbing avocados and mango trees with and playing soccer. COVID-19 and incompetence by the government of my country killed Isaac and Menor, two friends of mine, classmates in middle school and high school, right? And the reality is that the death of each of these friends diminished me. Those of us that believe and live by the tenets of the Ubuntu moral philosophy believe that our collective humanity ties us together. We are humans only through the humanity of others, what Martin Luther King called a single garment of destiny. Hundreds have died in Equatorial Guinea as a result of COVID. Thousands have died throughout Africa. Hundreds of thousands have died around the world. As we sit here today, as we talk today, hundreds are dying in Brazil and India and many other places, right? And each single one of these deaths diminishes our collective humanity. So the stakes could indeed not be higher. So the question for me is, what are we going to do about it? What are we together going to do to build the world we want to live in, to build a good society? So in the remaining time, once I stop talking here, we could talk about the weak social systems, the crumbling healthcare infrastructure that failed my childhood friends. We could discuss, the appropriateness of sweeping lockdown measures. We could talk about the food security issues and criminalization and police brutality in our streets in Africa. And we could propose solutions to these things, right? We could talk about the covenant of economic and social and cultural rights, which Dr. Duga alluded to. And these are rights that uphold uphold the right to everyone to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Requires the state invest the maximum available resources in taking deliberate steps towards that goal. This covenant, as Dr. Duga alluded to, also protects the rights to education, food, clean drinking water, and more. Yeah. So we could engage in that conversation, but I wholeheartedly believe that a genuine commitment to building a good society, the world we want to live in, calls on us all to challenge ourselves. It calls on us to go beyond the signed, the ratified covenants, protocols. It calls on us to ascertain how we can collectively build more Ubuntu, how we can share more Ubuntu, how we can celebrate and honor our collective humanity. The stakes could not be higher, my friends. But this is our opportunity to act and help bend the proverbial arc of the moral universe towards justice and equality. And what are we going to do about it? I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Tutu, thank you. You've really set the scene for our Q&A now. I'm just going to invite Dr. Duga and Edwan back onto the stage so we can continue with our conversations. I'd like to encourage those who are with us, please do send in any questions that you may have. That was incredibly powerful. Thank you to the three of you for articulating really strongly very different views as to the relationship between human rights and the pandemic. I want to start off with a question that I know one of our attendees, Monte, kind of alludes to, which is in terms of, I mean, there's a mention here, and there's a broad intervention about the importance of civil society being empowered. And a question I have for you all, we heard from Dr. Duga the challenges of a first generation of laws being implemented, and then more advanced laws potentially being used and simply copied and pasted from Europe in terms of lockdown strategies, and then having to reconcile that. What should be the role of civil society in this? And actually, what has been the role of civil society in your respective countries or in other countries that you are aware of that may have either aided in challenging overreach in terms of human rights violations, or where you think more could have been done? Maybe I can start with Dr. Duga. Oh, actually, no. Actually, Edwan, I know we ended up cutting you off a little bit. Perhaps I can come to you first, if that's okay. Edwan, you're on mute. Well, as you, there we go. You're back. There we go.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nizam, for the question. I think civil societies have always been the backbone of advocacy in many countries, especially in African countries. Now, when we look at the role of the civil society, they are there like the watchdog. You know, the violations that are perpetrated by the state is being brought to the lamplight by the civil societies. They are there to cry for the fight against gender-based violence, torture, child marriage, and all of those negative or harmful practices that are going on. And so I think that when the government gives the chance for the civil society to be able to come up, especially at the level of implementation. I know that most of our countries, most of the African countries, they do have good laws on the ground, but at the level of implementation, there's a serious problem there. Because if these laws were being implemented like they're supposed to be, and then most of these issues that we are talking about today would have been mitigated at one point or the other. So I think that governments should actually open up, work with civil societies And because they are the ones that are on the ground, they work with the communities directly. They know the things that the citizens or the people are going through, and they know exactly how to get rid of those issues. So my point is that the government should actually give the chance or work together with civil society so that together they can fight and make the society a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwin. And Tutu, may I come to you next?
Most certainly. So I hope, Nizam, the work came clear. You know, is that when we're talking about Equatorial Guinea, we're talking about a place where civil society organizations are not even allowed to operate, right? So I myself find myself in exile, and many of my colleagues work in exile. So this is a situation in which even in the face of such a horrendous pandemic, the government restricted any chance that anyone but the government itself or the UN present in the country could have anything whatsoever to do with anything. I am a member of the Equatorial Guinean Commission of Jurists, and as such, you know, we try to find ways to offer legal assistance to people that were being arrested, people that were being tortured in the face of this. And as lawyers, you know, we could get certain access, but members of civil society lack that access. Again, because we're talking about a government that have tightened all the bolts and there's no space for civil society to do the great work that needs to be done.
Thank you very much. Dr. Duga, a similar question on civil society and any reflections you have on the role civil society has in perhaps holding governments to account. Of course, there's a spectrum of governments across the continent. So, you know, perhaps the Cameroon context.
Thank you, Nizam. It's a question that makes me laugh because I'm an observer in this particular area. I observe the way the civil society functions, especially at these present times. I'm more on the protection side, that is the litigation side, and we are still waiting for the first cases to come. However, you would have two kinds of civil society organizations at the present moment. Those that are involved in health issues, that are out there collaborating with the government. If you were to ask them, they would say they are protecting human rights, especially the right to health. They are putting in their own contribution, which is very normal. Then you have the other group of civil society organizations that are supposed to be looking at the basic rights, that even in times of crisis like this, are human rights protected normally. What I observe is that most of them are in the hiding for reasons of their own personal safety also. If things are not good enough out there, nobody wants to go out there. So it's difficult for me to make a judgment on what those civil society organizations are doing. We would have to wait for their reports to come out for them to document the particular instances of human rights violations that they would have noticed. As I said, this topic at the moment is still to be approached with a lot of caution, because even in the US or in Europe, I don't see civil society organizations, international NGOs standing at the forefront today saying that there have been human rights violations. It's a little more challenging for African countries to say there have been human rights violations because there is a dilemma. There's a dilemma. Do you forego some of the rights to protect the right to health, to protect human life, or do you go implementing those other basic rights and then you allow everyone to die subsequently? I think it's after a couple of years when things would have settled down that we'll be able to start making cases on violations of human rights.
Dr. Duga, you've perfectly segued into my question to Edwin here, which was actually going to be to mention the things that we're seeing in Europe, in the UK, certainly, where we've been in lockdown for over 4 months now, pretty much non-stop since Christmas, where there is now a growing feeling by small groups that are growing about there being some infringement of their civil liberties and an extension, human rights. So Edouane, my question to you, I think you very articulately mentioned to us some of the gross violations in terms of the COVID-19 restrictions. And of course, you talked about the disparity that we already have in Cameroon in terms of access to education, the gender inequalities, and so on and so forth. And I guess my question to yourself was going to be an extension of what Dr. Duga has just said, which is, in terms of these violations, is there an awareness within, is there an awareness that these violations are taking place? Or do you feel people are willing to perhaps give some of these things up? And I think this goes into a much more philosophical question, to survive, right? So where you have a pandemic that might be causing life and death situations where you have access or no access to good healthcare potentially, that you're willing to give some of these things up to survive. Is that a tension that's happening is that a discussion, a debate that is actively being had, do you feel, in the communities that you were mentioning?
Thank you, Nizam. I think, like Dr. Juga said, this is very, very philosophical. And of course, it is true that people are afraid of the pandemic. It is threatening to life. And on the other hand, the fact that schools were closed, or the fact that borders were closed, wasn't really, at that point in time, wasn't really a violation to the people. To them, they knew that they were being protected by the state against the virus. So at that point, they did not take it as a violation. But like we will, like Dr. Juga said, do we prefer to live? Do we prefer our rights are being guaranteed, or we prefer to die or follow? I don't know how to put it. Like it's kind of confusing. It's kind of yeah, to the people. Now they prefer to go out, they want to go out. Even when there was imposition, people say you have to put on your mask before you go out or before you travel out of the town or in the taxi, you have to put on your mask. But I tell you that there are people who really did not care about it. There are people who really didn't bother about having a mask. They will tell you that this thing is just some political stuff by the government. There are pastors who even in church, they will encourage their Christians to greet each other directly, and they say this thing is just some government stuff that wants to send you away from God and stuff like that. So creating awareness is the first thing. Not that this are infringed into their human rights. They are not even aware of it, and so they just go ahead to observe the measures that have been imposed by the government. And at one point, it's going to be very, very interesting for an association or for an NGO to be able to take maybe some hospitals to the court for infringing upon the rights of their patients also, because like what we have now, the isolation centers or for patients with COVID, they serve as death traps. So many people, when you take your patients there, you're not sure the person is going to come out alive. You don't have access to visit the person like they say they should have access, even with their mask on and stuff like that. So I think that to me, advocacy is very, very important. We need to create awareness, let the citizens themselves know that these are your rights that are being infringed, even though it is being done so for your own protection, for your own good. So that awareness should be created Edouane, to the citizens.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. And Tutu, let me come to you. I think there's something, and please allow me to share my condolences for the loss of your friend Tutu. Really sorry to hear that. And ask a question, kind of which Edouane has touched on slightly, which is when you have something like a pandemic, which is invisible and which seems to touch every element of government, of process, of policy, of civil society, all of it, and nothing is hidden. From a legal perspective, we've heard Dr. Duga and Edwan and yourself mention that legally things have been found out, if you will. I want to flip the question slightly, and maybe in the context of Equatorial Guinea, have you seen any opportunities born out of the pandemic in particular, and born out of a heightened awareness? Because I think when you have something that every single individual is at risk of experiencing somehow, or will be affected somehow, it raises a consciousness that isn't otherwise possible. Yeah. And I think that raised consciousness offers opportunity for change. What does that look like in Equatorial Guinea?
Yeah. Thank you. That's an outstanding question. First of all, I wanted to say one of the challenges that we have had, certainly in Equatorial Guinea and many other places, is that awareness when there is a flow of information and the government does not restrict information. And the reality is that in many places, access to information has been something that most governments have restricted. I mean, there are many countries, whether because at the same time they were dealing with COVID, there were elections, or for many other reasons, the internet was cut off, right? And citizens that needed real information about how to protect themselves did not have that, So that's something that has to be out there. In terms of your questions, most certainly, as mentioned earlier, EG Justice is outside, and many of my colleagues are outside. And one thing that's happened since this pandemic is, as most people have realized they can go out, and as most people are home, those people with access, the few with access to a cell phone where they could get access to WhatsApp or to internet somewhere, have become a lot more engaged, right? Seeing the violations that are happening in the street, seeing the disparity, while most people are home without food, the presidential families were having birthday parties and weddings and flying in artists from Nigeria and other places in the midst of a pandemic. That encouraged a lot more young people to say, we want to know how we can be engaged in this fight. So, we've gone from being an organization that did not have memberships to having to create 2 affiliated organizations that would deal with young people, trying to figure out how they can use art, how they can use theater, how they can use all these different techniques and social media and Instagram and all these things to become engaged citizens. And now we have a large number of people willing to learn about human rights, willing to learn about holding governments accountable. So certainly there is a silver lining, there is a plus here.
Tutu, thank you. And Dr. Duga, I have a very specific question for you, if I may. I mean, you mentioned the first generation and a similar theme to opportunity. You mentioned the first generation of rights and legal rights and human rights, and you talked about the ICCPR. Is this an opportunity to expedite the next generation of laws because of the way in which it's been scrutinized?
I think it is. I think it is an opportunity to expedite the next generation of rights. The only problem is that under the present circumstances, the rights would be conflicting, and one may constitute a stumbling block to the other. If we decide to advance the right to health, which is an issue today, there comes a time when schools have to be suspended. Otherwise, you provide compulsory and available vaccine for everybody. If you don't do that, you cannot guarantee the right to education. Unless you provide compulsory and effective vaccines for everybody, you cannot ask people to go to work normally as they would do, because you have to reduce crowds. So yes, I agree with you. It's probably the time to leapfrog into the realization of the second generation rights in a more concrete manner. The problem also would be changing even the language of the instrument that provides the second generation rights, because the language of the instrument does not make it compulsory for states to provide those rights. the language of the instrument says the state can realize those rights depending on the availability of the means and financial resources. So yes, states are going to raise the fact that they are not African states, they are not financially viable to implement the second generation rights. So if the language of the instrument can be changed as the language of the first of the ICCPR, which makes it compulsory upon ratification of that instrument for the states to implement those rights, then yes, I agree with you, there's an opportunity to leapfrog into a direct implementation and compulsory implementation of the second generation rights.
Thank you, Dr. Duga. This has been a fascinating conversation, and we've run out of time, unfortunately, and it's just the beginning and a window into what is a very complex situation that's unraveling across the continent, and not just the continent, but also in Europe and in other places where we've seen a lot of rights have to be suspended for dealing with the pandemic, of course. I have one last question. You have 10 seconds to answer it, so no pressure. And I'm going to go this in reverse order. Dr. Duga, what is giving you hope at the moment for the building of a good society?
The hope is in the fact that we are getting more global. And if we can get a global village, then we would import good models from other countries and we'll definitely have a good society. That's the way I look at it. If you remain clustered in your own little corner, then there's very little hope for us to have a good society.
And I think we're doing that right now. Thank you. Tutu, what's giving you hope?
Seeing hundreds and thousands of young people interested in learning about human rights and figuring out how they can become part of this fight towards justice and equality.
Brilliant. Edouin, what's giving you hope?
To me, coming together, sharing our experiences and learning from each other, it's going to give us the hope of having a better society. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, we are grateful to you, Edouin, for leading on this particular webinar on our behalf and for bringing this important topic to the attention of our community, which we will share afterwards. Edouin, Dr. Duga, Tutu, thank you so much for your time, for this fascinating conversation, for the hard work that you're doing every single day in building a good society, and we hope to join you in those efforts. Emma.
Well, thank you, Edouin, Dr. Duga, Tutu, and to our audience for joining in on our discussion on human rights protection in an African context. And see you all again soon on Good Society Forum. Bye.
Bye.